Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. My name's Alex, and until about a year ago, I thought Emma and I had finally found our dream apartment in San Jose, California. It was everything we wanted, a quiet, one-bedroom place tucked into a cozy, tree-lined neighborhood. The kind of area where you'd feel safe enough to take an evening stroll or sit out on the patio with a cup of coffee, just enjoying the peace of the world around you. We both worked long hours. Emma's a nurse and I'm in IT. So having a calm, comfortable home to return to after a tough day was something we'd been craving for a while. But that sense of peace didn't last nearly as long as we'd hoped. When we first moved in, we met Kevin, our upstairs neighbor. He was a middle-aged guy in his late 40s or early 50s with thinning hair, a bit of a potbelly, and a friendly smile. He came down to introduce himself on the day we were unloading the moving truck. He was holding a 6-pack of craft beer, which he handed to us with a warm, "Welcome to the building. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to knock." At first, everything about Kevin seemed perfectly normal. Too normal, maybe. He was the friendly, older guy you'd expect in a neighborhood like this. For the first couple of weeks, he was nice, almost overly so. He'd wave when he saw us, ask how our day was going, and leave little notes on our door. Things like reminders about trash pickup or tips for dealing with the building's sometimes temperamental laundry machines. It all seemed harmless enough at first, but after a while, it became clear that Kevin was a little off. It started with small things. Kevin would knock on our door late at night, sometimes as late as 11 p.m., just to check in and make sure everything was okay. At first, we'd answer, thinking it might be an emergency, but it never was. It was always something trivial like, "Did you hear that weird noise outside?" Or, "Do you know if the water's been shut off?" At first, we didn't think much of it. It was just the kind of neighborly thing to do, right? But then the questions started getting more personal. What time do you usually go to bed? Or, do you guys eat out a lot? It was small talk at first, but it began to feel invasive. He'd linger in the doorway even after we tried to end the conversation. His gaze, always a little too focused on us, a little too curious. One night, Emma was home alone while I worked late. She texted me to say Kevin had knocked on the door again, this time claiming he'd smelled gas in the building and wanted to make sure we hadn't left the stove on. She told him everything was fine, but he wouldn't leave. "He just stood there, Alex," she texted. I had to almost close the door in his face to get him to leave. After that, we decided to start ignoring his knocks, but that didn't stop him. He'd sit on the stairs outside our apartment, waiting for one of us to come out. When we did, he'd act surprised, like he just happened to be there. "Oh, hey, heading out?" he'd say, then fall into step with us as we walked to our car or headed to the mailbox. It didn't matter how short our responses were, how uncomfortable we looked. Kevin just wouldn't take the hint. He'd ask questions about our schedules, about what we did for work, even about what we liked to eat. It wasn't friendly small talk anymore. It felt more like an interrogation. Things really started to escalate when we realized Kevin had started watching us. Our apartment faced the building's shared courtyard, and Kevin's unit was directly above ours. Emma was the first one to notice. One afternoon, she was sitting on the patio when she spotted him, staring down at her through the window. She waved, hoping he'd get the hint, but instead, he just smiled. A slow, deliberate grin that made her feel uncomfortable all over again. From then on, we started keeping the curtains closed. But even though we couldn't see him anymore, the feeling of being watched never went away. It was like there was a constant weight in the air, a sense that we were always under his gaze, even when we couldn't see him. It was a feeling that gnawed at us, making the apartment feel less like a home and more like a cage. 6 months after we moved in, the situation reached its breaking point. It was a Saturday night, and Emma and I had decided to stay in, order pizza, and watch a movie. Around 9 p.m., there was a knock at the door. We exchanged a glance. We both knew who it was. Ignoring it, we turned up the volume on the TV, hoping he'd just leave. But the knocking continued, louder, more insistent this time. "Alex, just open the door and tell him to leave," Emma whispered, a nervous edge to her voice. I sighed, pausing the movie, and stood up to answer the door. When I opened it, there was Kevin, standing there with a weird, agitated look on his face. "Hey, sorry to bother you," he said, his voice oddly shaky, "but I think someone's been trying to break into my apartment. Did you see or hear anything?" I shook my head, confused. "No, we haven't. Maybe you should call the cops." Yeah, maybe," he muttered, glancing past me into our apartment. Then in the same weird, shaky voice, he added, "Mind if I come in for a second? Just to, I don't know, make sure everything's okay?" I stepped into the doorway to block his view, suddenly on edge. "Actually, now's not a good time," I said, trying to sound firm. Kevin's expression changed in an instant. His friendly smile faded, replaced by something darker. "Oh, okay," he said after a long pause. "Well, if you hear anything, let me know." He turned and walked away, but the whole interaction left me feeling unsettled, like something wasn't right. That night, neither Emma nor I could sleep. Around 2 a.m., I got up to get a glass of water. As I passed through the living room, I noticed a faint shadow moving outside the window. My heart froze. I cautiously pulled the curtain back just enough to see out. There he was, Kevin, standing motionless in the courtyard, staring up at our apartment. I woke Emma immediately, and we both decided it was time to call the police. By the time they arrived, Kevin was gone. We explained everything to them, his late-night knocks, the strange behavior, the way he'd been lurking around. But since he hadn't technically done anything illegal, there was nothing they could do. "Just let us know if he comes back," one of the officers said before leaving. But the sense of dread stayed with us long after they were gone. The next morning, we found a note slipped under our door. It was from Kevin. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, and it read, "I'm sorry if I scared you. I just don't want anything bad to happen to you two." That was it. We had enough. The next month, we broke our lease and moved out. We lost our deposit, but we gained something much more valuable, our peace of mind. To this day, whenever I hear a knock at the door, whether it's in our new place or anywhere else, I can't shake the feeling that it's Kevin, that he's still out there watching, waiting. And I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did? What would he have done? I don't want to find out. I've always been a private person, and so was my neighbor Todd. We'd wave to each other when we passed on the street or exchanged a quick "hey" when we ran into each other while doing yard work. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary, just two people living in the same quiet suburb of Northern California. It's the kind of place where the most exciting thing that happens is someone's sprinkler breaking in the middle of the night. Safe, serene, and a little dull, which is exactly why I moved here. I was looking for peace after a messy breakup, and for a while, that's exactly what I got. But that peace began to crack about 3 weeks ago, and I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. It was a typical Tuesday night, sometime after midnight. I couldn't sleep, so I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone. The house was dark, the kind of stillness you only get in quiet neighborhoods. That's when I noticed Todd's house. The lights were on. All of them. Every single light. It was so strange. Todd wasn't the type to keep his lights on at night. His house was usually dark and quiet, just like the rest of the neighborhood. So seeing his windows glowing like that at 3 a.m. felt off. Curious, I slid off the couch and peeked through the blinds. And that's when I saw him. Todd, standing in his front yard staring directly at my house. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was out there waiting for someone, or maybe he'd had a late night and was just thinking. But as I watched him, something didn't sit right. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even shifting his weight. He was just standing there, perfectly still, his eyes locked on my house. I don't know how long I watched him. Minutes? Longer? The more I stared, the more it felt like my skin was crawling. He didn't even blink. And I swear, I felt like he knew I was watching him. There was something unnerving about it. Something deliberate. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was drunk, maybe he was upset, or maybe I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. That image of him, standing there in the dark, unmoving, kept coming back. The next day, Todd acted like nothing was unusual. When I saw him pulling out of his driveway, he gave me the same casual wave he always did, as if nothing had happened. He didn't seem drunk, didn't seem upset, just his usual self. That's when I started to convince myself I was imagining things. But then it happened again. A few nights later, it was around 2 a.m. I had woken up for some reason, and as soon as I did, I saw it. Todd's house was lit up again. The lights blared like something out of a horror movie. And sure enough, when I peeked out the window, there he was, standing in the same spot, staring. It was like he had memorized the position. The way his body stood in the yard was so rigid, so unnatural, like he was waiting for something, or someone. This time, I didn't try to ignore it. I kept watching. I didn't even know why I felt the need to stay there, watching him through the blinds. But I did. The longer I stared, the more I began to question what was going on. I thought about calling out to him, asking if he was okay, but there was something about the stillness of his presence that made my stomach twist. Something cold. So I just watched him. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked back into his house. The lights flickered off one by one. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I couldn't shake the image of him just standing there, watching me. For the next week, it became a regular thing. Every few nights, I would wake up in the middle of the night to find Todd outside, staring at my house. Sometimes, I would even catch him looking through the windows during the day, when I was outside to check the mail or mow the lawn. There was no mistake about it. He was watching me. Not just casually either. He was studying me. It was like I was the subject of some kind of twisted, silent observation. One afternoon, I went outside to mow the lawn. I remember turning around and feeling like someone was watching me. I looked up, and there he was, standing on his porch, watching me. Not a wave, not a word, just a silent stare. The kind of stare that makes you feel like you're a specimen in a lab. It wasn't just the staring that bothered me. It was that he never spoke. Not once did he say anything, even though I could feel his eyes on me every time I was outside. At this point, I knew I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I wasn't imagining it, I was being watched. So, I called the police. I explained the situation to the dispatcher and asked them to send someone over to check it out. They told me they'd send an officer, but of course, by the time the police got to my street, Todd was already inside. The officer came, listened to my story, and politely nodded, but I could tell he didn't take it seriously. "Just keep an eye out," he said. "If it gets worse, give us another call." That was the last thing I wanted to hear. I didn't want to just keep an eye out. I wanted this to stop, but it didn't stop. It only got worse. It all came to a head one night, 3 days after I'd called the police. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of something heavy banging against the side of my house. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it was rhythmic, like someone was hitting something. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the back door, my heart thudding in my chest. When I flicked the switch, I saw Todd standing by my fence, holding a crowbar and smashing it against the wood. "Todd!" I shouted. "What the hell are you doing?" He didn't look at me, didn't even flinch. He just kept swinging the crowbar, hitting the fence with a dull thud over and over. It was like I wasn't even there. I called the police again. This time, they arrived a little faster. But when they got to my house, Todd was gone. They found the crowbar lying on the grass and dents in my fence where he'd struck it. The officer told me they'd speak to him in the morning, but I couldn't shake the fear gnawing at me. The next day, I was sitting in my living room trying to gather my nerves when I heard a crash from the direction of the window. My heart stopped. I turned around just in time to see Todd smashing through my living room window. He was holding the crowbar again, his face twisted in a way I'd never seen. He was coming toward me, fast. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed the first thing I could, a heavy lamp, and swung it at him. It connected with a sickening thud, knocking him back. He dropped the crowbar, and for a moment he just stood there, dazed. I ran outside and called 911 as I heard him crashing to the floor behind me. By the time the police arrived, Todd was unconscious on the living room floor. I later found out that Todd had been going through a mental breakdown. He had convinced himself that I was watching him, spying on him through his windows, reporting back to someone. He thought I was part of some grand conspiracy against him. I can't go back to that house. I can't even drive past it without feeling sick. For the time being, I'm staying at a friend's place, but I don't know how long I'll be able to hide from what happened. Every time I close my eyes, I see Todd standing in his yard, staring, waiting. It's the kind of thing that changes you, the kind of thing that makes you question everything and everyone. My name is Emily. I'm in my late 20s now, and I've always been a pretty quiet person, just someone who likes to live life without causing any trouble. I moved to a small town in California about 2 years ago, hoping for a fresh start after a difficult breakup. I rented a small house on a quiet street, and for the first few months, everything was perfect, peaceful, serene, just the way I like it. But then there was Greg, the guy who lived next door. It started out innocently enough. Greg was your typical neighbor, mid-40s, not overly friendly, but not rude either. He'd wave when we crossed paths outside, or maybe exchange a couple of words if we ran into each other at the mailbox. Nothing unusual, nothing to raise any red flags. But as time went on, things began to change. It wasn't until I noticed him watching me that I began to feel uncomfortable. I'd catch him staring out of his window at me, sometimes when I was gardening or getting the mail. I told myself I was probably imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always lurking. It wasn't a casual glance. It was more like he was waiting for something. One day, I was pulling into my driveway after work and I saw him standing in his front yard. He didn't wave, didn't even acknowledge me, just stood there, staring. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just having a weird day or something, but it didn't end there. A week later, I got a note on my door. It was typed, not handwritten, but the message was clear. "You've been parking in front of my house too much. It's bothering me. Move your car or I'll call the HOA." It was weird. The parking situation on our street was plenty wide, and there was no issue with me parking in front of his house. I didn't park there every day, but occasionally I'd leave my car there if I was unloading groceries or something. But that note, it felt a little over the top. I figured maybe he was just having a bad day, so I ignored it. Big mistake. The next day, I got another note, this time taped to my front door. It was more aggressive this time. "I told you not to park in front of my house. Are you stupid or just rude? Move your damn car." At this point, I was getting a little freaked out. I'd barely interacted with this guy, and yet here he was, sending me 2 notes in less than 24 hours. I didn't want to escalate things, so I made sure to park in front of my house from that point on. It didn't stop there. I noticed a change in Greg's behavior. He started showing up on his porch every time I stepped outside. He'd just stand there, arms crossed, watching me, just staring like he was waiting for me to do something wrong. It felt suffocating. Then, one night, around 10:30 p.m., I was sitting in my living room watching TV. I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was immediately on edge. I opened the door, and there he was, Greg, standing on my porch with a look of pure anger in his eyes. "You've been making too much noise at night," he said, his voice sharp. "You need to keep it down. I don't want to hear your TV or your music anymore." I was dumbfounded. I hadn't been playing any music, and I hadn't had the TV on loud. My house was pretty quiet always. I explained this to him, but he just kept shaking his head, cutting me off. "I don't care what you say. I can hear it. It's too much. You better start respecting my space or I'll report you." He stood there for a few more seconds, staring me down before he turned and walked back to his house. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Was he serious? The days that followed were even worse. Every time I stepped outside, Greg was there, watching me like a hawk. One afternoon, I was mowing my lawn, and I could see him through his window, glaring at me. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard not to feel like I was being hunted. It wasn't just the stares anymore. He started confronting me in person over the smallest things. One day, I was trimming my bushes, and he came storming over, all worked up. "Why the hell is your hedge so big?" he yelled. "It's making my house look bad. Get it under control." I was taken aback. I hadn't even realized the bushes were that overgrown. I apologized, said I'd take care of it, but he wasn't having any of it. "You better, or I'll be calling someone. I don't need to be living next to someone who doesn't keep their yard in shape." It was always like that with him. No matter what I did, he found something to complain about. Things started to escalate quickly after that. One evening, I was sitting on my porch, just trying to unwind after a long day at work. I saw Greg outside again, pacing back and forth in front of his house. He was muttering to himself, and I couldn't make out what he was saying. Then, suddenly, he stopped, turned towards me, and yelled, "You better stay the hell out of my business. I don't want to see your face ever again." I didn't know what to do. I'd never even talked to him before this. I hadn't done anything to provoke him, but it was clear this was more than just a simple neighborly dispute. The next few days, I found things on my porch, noticed things moved around, items I didn't remember putting there. A broken flower pot, a piece of paper with strange scribbles on it. One morning, I opened my front door to find a small rock on my doorstep with a note underneath it. "You're being warned." I couldn't tell if he was trying to intimidate me or what, but I felt like I was being stalked. His presence was everywhere, like I couldn't escape. Every time I turned around, he was there in my peripheral vision, watching. One night, things took a dark turn. It was around 2 a.m., and I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps outside. I thought I was dreaming at first, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of a knock on my door. I was frozen. I didn't want to open it. I didn't even want to get out of bed. But then I heard his voice. "Emily, I know you're in there. Open the door." I felt my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and texted a friend, telling them to stay on the line, but I didn't get a response. The knocks kept coming, louder and louder, almost like he was banging on the door now. I didn't open it. I stayed silent, holding my breath. The knocking continued for what felt like hours. Then suddenly, it stopped. I waited. A long time. But he never came back. The next morning, I was so shaken I called the police. I told them everything about the notes, the confrontations, the stalking. They told me they couldn't do much unless he physically threatened me, but they'd keep an eye on things. Since then, Greg has kept to himself. I don't see him on his porch anymore, and the notes have stopped. It feels like the storm has passed, but I still can't shake the unease. Every time I step outside, I find myself glancing toward his house, half expecting him to be there, watching. I don't know what changed, but for now, I'm grateful for the quiet. Maybe he finally got bored, or maybe the police scared him off. Either way, I'm trying to move on. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.